Professor Lovejoy's new work connects African and American slavery more seamlessly than Brian Davis did in the course. He's the founding director of the Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on the Global Migrations of African Peoples and formerly a member of UNESCO's Slave Route Project. He's the editor of the Harriet Tubman series on African diaspora for Africa World Press, and he serves on the editorial boards of many prestigious presses and journals in the fields of his expertise. He is, among many other honors, he's received the President's Research Award of Merit at York University, the Lifetime Achievement from the Canadian Association of African Studies, and the Distinguished Africanist Award by the University of Texas at Austin. His current work is to spearhead the Shad Biography Project, which focuses on recovering the histories and voices of Atlantic Africans, those born free in Africa and then enslaved to be transported across the Atlantic, focusing on biographies, testimonies, and voices of individual Africans from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The project aims to build and use an online digital repository to house the life stories of those who crossed the Middle Passage from freedom to enslavement. Professor Lovejoy calls these Atlantic African stories freedom narratives to distinguish them from slave narratives whose authors were born as slaves in the Americas. And he discovers in these narratives new perspectives on transatlantic migration and the influence of that migration on Western Africa, the Americas, and implicitly Europe. His talk today is part of his series called Equiano's World Beyond Slavery and Abolition, and the talk today's title is Vassa's Associates, a Son of Africa and the Enlightenment. Please join me in welcoming Paul Lovejoy.
Thank you very much, yes, very much indeed. Well, I'm happy to be back and to continue telling you about my fascination with this man, Gustavus Vassa, born without Equiano. And today for me is actually a very special day because what I'm about to do with you is to launch on my website that is Equiano's World. And I'll do that in just a second. But first, I just wanted to talk about this first slide a bit because it does tell you a little bit about my approach to looking into this man's life. The three individuals that are actually pictured here, Edouard Despard, Queen Charlotte, and Anthony Benezet. Vassa didn't know any one of these three people, but all three of these individuals in indirect ways were connected with his life and the things that he did. Edward Despard, as you may know, is often considered, certainly was considered in his lifetime to be a real traitor to the British Empire, to the British Crown, and was actually executed in London, I think, if I can get the date right, 1801. And the connection with Vassa here is that Despard was active on the Mosquito Shore. And if Vassa had not experienced his transformation on the Mosquito Shore, where he decided that he could not be involved in anything to do with slavery, and that slavery was an institution that could not be reformed or made easier for people, and he abandoned and he left and went back, made his way back to London. If he had not done that, if he had stayed on the Mosquito Shore, he would have been involved in the scheme that Despard and indeed Horatio Nelson were involved in, which was the attempt to conquer the Spanish Empire. Despard was one of the two leaders and one of the few survivors of the attempt to do that. and so their lives in a certain kind of way almost came together. Queen Charlotte is important because he dedicated his autobiography to her. He dedicated his autobiography to her because at the time she was considered a gossip. She was considered to be the Mulatta queen. Because in her ancestry, actually in terms of reality, it had no impact at all, but in her ancestry, through Portuguese a royal family, she had a connection with Africa, and therefore was distantly of African descent. And this was known, and that was one of the reasons that he dedicated his book to her. And Benezet, of course, was extremely important, Quaker in Philadelphia, and although Vassa went to Philadelphia twice, once while Benezet was alive, he apparently never met him, but he was strongly influenced by him, as is clear in the footnotes in his interesting narrative. Because sometimes while Vassa's claims about what he knew, what he saw, what he did have been challenged, sometimes even he's being accused of plagiarism or taking things from other people's work and then saying that's what he saw and did. This is really not fair. I mean, we're scholars. We're taught to use footnotes. Vassa used footnotes and said what he read entirely. And then he gets turned around and gets accused of, but he cites them. I mean, he says what he saw. And Benezet had nothing to say about the interior of the Bight of Biafra in anything he wrote. He didn't know anything about the interior of the Bight of Biafra. He jumped from the Kingdom of Benin to the Kingdom of Congo in his discussions. And in some ways, Vassa thought, I thought that he was, in effect, filling in a gap in Benezet's work by saying and doing what he did. And I think it's the reason that Vassa speculates, and he's wrong, that where he came from was actually a dependency of the Kingdom of Benin. It was not. I think that's him reading Benezet and his own experiences. There were parts of Igbo land that were dependencies of the Kingdom of Benin, but they were all on the western side of the Niger River, not on the eastern side of the Niger River, which is where he was from. So I've included these three as an example because what I'm going to show you now, if we can switch to the website, is the approach that I'm really taking now is that everything that I'm doing in relation to biographies are on websites. And the development of websites, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolutely essential part of modern scholarship and modern dissemination of knowledge. Websites are complex, as you, I'm sure, all know. This website owes its vitality, its substance, its spirit, everything, to a group of absolutely wonderful people, mostly students of mine, who've helped to create it. And this current version owes its technical dimension specifically to Cardicade Chada in Toronto, who's actually built the back end and indeed the front end of this website. And now this is going to be interesting. What I want to show you, if I can, is what we do on the website before I come back to talking specifically about some of the associates of Vassa, such as the three individuals that I put on the front slide of my talk today. But many of the other people, of course, he knew very well, and at this point in time, we have approximately, I think we have 65 individuals whose summary biographies and images populate this part of the website. And I'll come back to that. But first, what I want to do is to show you what we're doing here. We're not finished. Many parts of the website, such as the project history, actually exist in draft form, but it's waiting for me to do the final revisions on it before we put it up. The direction, I mentioned Kadake. The other person who's been crucial in my team in putting this together is Bruno Varas, who's completing his PhD thesis under me at York. Kadake is from India. Bruno is from Brazil. And as you will see, when you look at the project team, which is enormous, that people come from everywhere, including the United States. I think we have one, but they're from Turkey, from Brazil, from Costa Rica, from Mexico, from everywhere. And this is one of the features that has been so enjoyable in doing this work, is that the team of people that we work together with are the kind of society we all want to live in. So this is my group, my team, going back quite a ways. And this is my advisory board, which consists of individuals who've developed their own websites and very important websites or are involved in one or more of the ones that I'm doing. So this is the platform. I can tell you what the platform is. It's the structure of the website, and it's a relational database project based on open source. And it's fully accessible, of course, without charge, and we're hoping that without any difficulty of access. And I hope that lack of difficulty of access continues through my lecture, since this is really the first time that I've attempted to show this. The website uses HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, which is College Scholarship Service, and we're using something that is called Bootstrap, which is a combination of JavaScript and CSS. This is all for the website front end. For the back end, the database we are hosting is on MySQL. Windius and SQL, which is a structured query language. All of this is hosted on Linux, base platform, which is an operating system like Mac or Windows. The website and MySQL database talk to each other using a programming language called PHP. We'll explain this in greater detail here for those people that need to know this or want to know this, because one of the things that's really crucial about what we're doing with I don't see it here, so there's a mistake. But we will have a section on here on the home page which are called best practices. We explain exactly what we're doing, why we're doing it, including the history of the website, which I already mentioned. Why are we doing this? Now, I've been working with websites since the early 2000s. And when we started doing these things, we didn't keep track of what we were doing. We were too busy experimenting. We were too busy doing, and we didn't even think. But now, it's very clear. You go back and look at early websites, very often you'll find websites where there's no name on them, there's no date, there's no explanation of anything in terms of how the website came into existence, or when it was changed, or why. So, along with many other people who are working on websites, including a website that's right here at the Hutchins Center, we're preoccupied with this concept of best practices. So this is the website. This section, which I'm not going to go into, is the section on context, in which we explain exactly what the 7 Years' War was, what the Abolition movement was, all of these types of issues that really relate to Vassa, the slave trade of the late 18th century, discussions of his Middle Passage, which it does include, all the text that he wrote that we've recovered where he describes the Middle Passage. And of course, as you're aware, the Middle Passage was the most fundamental thing about his autobiography because it was published just when the parliamentary inquiry into the slave trade, looking into the possibility that it should be abolished, was open in 1789, in early 1789. In fact, the publication of his book was delayed a couple of months because the parliamentary hearings were delayed a couple of months because King George III was having one of his periodic mental breakdowns, and they wanted to wait until that was under control before they started the inquiry. And in the same way, the publication of his book, he self-published the book, as you know, was delayed as well. So, the travels, there's a section on chronology, which includes a list of all of his life events, which is meant as a reference point, and a timeline which we're still developing, which will connect on a timeline to different events when you click it. And then the maps, some of which I've already shown you. This wonderful map that was created a number of years ago and published by Bois and Carey is extremely interesting because one thing it shows visually is that Vassa traveled a lot. He crossed those oceans so many times, he went so many different places, and this map at least shows that, while the maps that we've developed here, including his Middle Passage, the Arctic expedition he was on, the 7 Years' War, his venture on the Mosquito Shore that I've talked about a bit, and same, the circum-Caribbean world that he went to. He said he went to 15 islands, plus 3 places in North America, Charleston, Savannah, and Philadelphia, which in a sense were part of the Caribbean. And his book tour, and somewhere last here, his London. And if you're ever in London, when I'm there, I'll be very, very happy to give you what I might call an Equiano tour, because I can take you to a lot of the locations. Most of the places he actually lived in no longer exist, but we can find out where they were. And even that, it's a walking tour, except for the one visit to Greenwich.
What part of London did he live in?
He lived in the West End, mostly. They're right here. He lived on Tottenham Street, which is just off of Tottenham Court Road at one point. He lived off a street that went up from Oxford Street. He lived in Soho.
Expensive real estate.
Now, and he, as I'll talk about more tomorrow, he actually rented Pleister's Hall which was a guild hall in the city of London. He rented the whole building, and you will see that actually, by the scale of that building, it was an enormous piece of property. And of course, he sublet his sublease. He didn't own it. He subleased it. It was a guild house, so they were up for lease every 15 years. And so for a period, he actually wrote his will at the City of London address. And therefore, he may have lived there temporarily at least. But the property really wasn't meant to be a residence. It was meant to be a business, or a series of businesses, which is what it was. So he lived all over. He knew London extremely well, needless to say. He knew England extremely well. He knew Scotland extremely well. He knew Ireland extremely well. He toured all these places extensively, which of course, is part of the story. The associates I'll come back to, but are divided between family, slavery, abolition, religious connections, and scientific and military government, really, should be. And then a section on questioning Equiano rather than Vassa, because here, the reason I call it Equiano's world is because he's known as Equiano, and so therefore, in a sense, this world that I'm looking at is an Equiano world, even though the person is Gustavus Vassa. And so questioning, where was he born, significance of his name, the scarification patterns that were so important, the portraits, there were 2 portraits of him, one on the cover of his book and another one which many people claim is not him. But I'm going to show you a picture of both of them tomorrow, and I'm not convinced that it's not him. I mean, I don't know. There's 2 artists painting the guy, and he doesn't look exactly alike, but anyway. We talk about slavery and trade in Igbo land, his views of slavery, which includes many quotes from interesting narrative of what he said about slavery in different contexts. And so on, attitudes towards race and culture, his connection with science and the Industrial Revolution, which I will talk about a bit today. Of course, his role in the abolition movement, what happened on the Mosquito Shore, which is so important, as I mentioned yesterday, because he got everything wrong in his autobiography, virtually, about what he was doing on the Mosquito Shore, even though it was an important point. And therefore, people who have drawn on his experience about what he says about the Mosquito Shore, uncritically, just have repeated the mistakes that he actually made himself. His connection with Sierra Leone was very important, not only because he was originally, as commissary of the Black Poor of London, in charge of helping to organize the first expedition, the disastrous expedition, where almost everybody died in 1787, until he got fired because of his objections to the way the thing was being organized or not being organized, and it turned out that he was absolutely right, because almost everybody died. Equiano and the concept of Orientalism, because Vassa really does, he goes all the way through the Mediterranean, is a big part of his life several times. And I'm asked the question whether Vassa was an African, was he an Igbo, or was he a what? And it explores some of the ideas that Alexander Bird, most especially, has developed, but goes beyond, I think, what Bird says, and so on. So that's questioning. And then when we get to studying, we're going to have all of his letters and all of his publications online. And to the extent that we can do it, we will have facsimiles of the originals as well as transliterations, so that we can actually search, because we haven't done this yet, but the website will have a search capability. It will have a number of things that we have not yet developed. So it will also include all of the other documents that we have about Vassa, and between letters and publications and these other documents, we have something like in the order of 150 to 200 documents, all of which will be accessible, which means that students and scholars will have these. They're there. And then there are a number of websites which we link and explain what they are, that exist, that of course that relate to either completely or partially to Vassa, or always called Equiano. And finally, the resources. Of course, we'll have a copy of one of the versions. Right now, it's the 4th edition that we have online, and we may stick with that. And we'll also have all of the newspaper references. There's a list of them. Just as we have the documents, we'll have a list of them so that you can search. And then, as I'll talk a little bit about, is the issue of, it comes back to his name, which I will go back into in just a second. But the research right now that we've done, that have done on the 19th century, have come up with approximately 20 different editions or partial republication of his work and so on. And I don't think that research is finished. I think we'll find much more than we have. But I can tell you one thing right now, that what is happening in everything that we found from the 19th century into the early 20th century, he's never referred to as Equiano. He's referred to as Gustavus Vassa. And so that this is an important dimension, as you already know from what I'm talking about. And then we have a full bibliography, because of course we can't really put up all of the publications because of copyright issues, but we certainly can provide links, and we can certainly provide details of where they are and what they are. Video resources that we haven't started to deal with, but which we will, and maybe even my 3 lectures at one point will end up being on there. So, why look at one man? Why look at Gustavus Vassa especially? Why is this important? And this leads me into, and if I could have the next website, please. Because all my work on slavery gradually, initially, I became more and more bothered by the term slave. I've been very strongly influenced by a number of people, including Rena Caceres, who doesn't even like to use the word slave. Because when we've talked about slavery and the way this all came about in the 1960s for me, the 1970s, was that the humanity and the dignity of the individuals that we were referring to as slaves was completely lost. In fact, I'd say for a long time, and when the word slave was used in the literature, scholarly literature, almost entirely referring to men. Now, I'm studying a man, but these were some of the things that started to bother me, and what really bothered me was, how do we recapture the fact that we're talking about people, we're talking about individuals who had lives, who had their own experiences, they had their own efforts to somehow survive and somehow to overcome the fact that they had been put into a condition of enslavement. And so it's not just a concern over a term, it's a concern over the fact that that term denies the humanity of people. So that's why I turned to biography, and the first big project that I did was with this man, Muhammad Gardu Bakwakwa. And as it's happened, Bruno Varas, who's helped me so much with the Equiano as a World project, came to study with me at York, and he was already an expert on this man, and he put together a website that together now we have developed into something that's quite substantial in and of itself, looking at this other African, also happens to be a male, but as I explained yesterday, and I saw a few nods among you that said that it's really very difficult to get accounts of women, much more difficult than it is to find accounts about men. So that's one of the problems that I'll come back to. But and it's a similar type of website which we've developed. There's one big difference, is that this website is in Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and it will be in Hausa. We've started the translations of things into Hausa, but all of the languages and all of the places that were influential or had an impact on this man will be represented, so that our efforts at accessibility is intended to break through that language barrier. And if I could have the next. In a sense, both of these individual websites led me to a bigger project, which, thank you very much, was referred to in the introduction, which is a website that I call Freedom Narratives, and for the reasons that were stated, that this is a website that deals with biographical information on individuals who were born in West Africa and experienced slavery for a period of their lives. In almost all cases of the ones that we have been able to recover, these were individuals who were born free. And in almost all cases, and it's a bias within the database, it's a bias within the database, but in almost all cases, those individuals died free. So slavery did not define these people's lives. It was an aspect, an episode that could be short or long that was part of their life. And it's the quest for freedom, which is so clear in so many of these accounts, that struck me as making a very big distinction about being born free and trying to die free, that said to myself that I couldn't really call these slave narratives in the same sense as they're often that phrase. That genre has developed particularly in North America, but we now know that there are actually more accounts than just the North America ones. And indeed, Bakwakwa is a perfect example. He could be looked at as a North American slave narrative, except that he doesn't fit into the pattern of North American slave narratives at all. First of all, he was not a slave in North America. He escaped from slavery in New York City when he got there. Second, he was very much, wasn't really on the Underground Railroad, but he wrote his autobiography in Canada in the 1850s. And so it goes against the grain in terms of how the Underground Railroad is perceived and understood. It goes against all kinds of things. But all of this led to the project, which we've been doing now for 6 or 7 years, which calls Freedom Narratives. We hope by the end of May that we'll have approximately 2,000 individuals with biographical details, where all the original documentation that we have will be online, the same way as is with Equiano's World. Where the analysis, we have been spending particularly a lot of help from Erica Melick Delgado, who did her PhD at the University of Worcester in England under Suzanne Schwartz, and is now working in a postdoc capacity to help to build this website, which requires putting all of the material in every individual into spreadsheets and giving those spreadsheets. We're working very closely with Michigan State University and the Matrix Center there in developing this website. And again, it's going to be the same type of access by going through these things. You can scroll down and do stuff. This is really going to take us a long time to do. Fortunately, we've just received additional funding, and we also, besides the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, has funded all of my projects, and I couldn't have done this without their very generous and wonderful support. But it's also been supported by the Mellon Foundation and I've just received another grant to carry this further. And I expect now that when we finish, if we ever finish the website, it will not be 2,000 people. We will have about 200,000 people that we can identify and give enough biographical information to give at least fragments of their lives, all again born in West Africa. Many staying within West Africa, never leaving. Many involved in the transatlantic traffic. Many involved in the trans-Saharan traffic. So that we are following as many people as we can, and we're working very closely with many other scholars. The advisory board that you saw for my Equiano's website actually includes people that are feeding us data for this website. And the last one, before I continue, but the last one is Freedom Narratives is really part of a bigger project which is funded by the Mellon Foundation and which is centered at MSU, which is called Enslaved Peoples of the Atlantic Slave Trade, the Historic Slave Trade. And it's a project in which the biography projects here at the Hutchins Center are a part of. There are seven projects that are involved in the Enslaved Initiative. And this initiative by the Mellon Foundation is intended to address one very serious problem about websites, which is that websites don't talk with each other. They're silos, they're isolated. And this website is intended to take the 7 websites, including the biography ones from here, as well as Freedom Narratives, as well as the one on liberated Africans, which was funded in its initial stages from here, and several other ones into a system where we can actually go across those websites and find information that will help us in terms of doing research. So this is, I think you can see the building blocks of individual Equiano, Vassa, individual Bakwakwa, right up straight through into something like this. And I'm sure that you're all really aware that this isn't just an aspect of the digital revolution. It's a revolution beyond the digital revolution. It's really the next level. The new version of Voyages that's out now is more friendly. It's more usable. It's of course, one of the spokes in this hub that's been created at MSU. But now what I want to do, if I can go back to the PowerPoint, thanks. Is this, she slipped. She moved up. Anyway, the next, I can do the next slide, can't I? Yeah. So this was our Gustavus Vassa, who he's named for, because I wanted just to briefly go back and talk about his name, why he kept his name, his slave name. He kept his slave name because King Gustavus Vassa was reputedly the hero of the Swedish people who freed themselves from the bondage of Danish rule. And Vassa accepted that in his predestination way of thinking, that he was predestined to be Gustavus Vassa for his people and to lead his people out of slavery. And only just to demonstrate that his name was Gustavus Vassa are these documents such as his marriage certificate. There's no Equiano. His last will and testament is Gustavus Vassa. Just one example of a notice of his death. Do I have a mouse? Yes. So in the last 3 lines of this newspaper ad, which is a North American newspaper. It's Gustavus Vassa. And here is the actually crucial document about his name for me. It's on the back of a letter that Vassa wrote to Granville Sharp in 1780. Now the letter itself, which I'm not showing you, is so important it's unbelievable, because on the letter he thanks Granville Sharp for loaning him 3 of Sharp's books on slavery. And he says very specifically, I really liked what you said on page 162. So this is Vassa talking about his own intellectual development and political awakening and political consciousness in relation to the slavery issues. It also, of course, demonstrates that he and Granville Sharp maintained a relationship even after the Annis Affair of the early 1770s. So, what's on the back is a strange thing. This letter, for some reason, is in the Sierra Leone collection at the University of Illinois in Chicago. How it ever got there, no one knows. Or anyway, if they do know, I haven't met them. But what it says on the back, in a different handwriting, it's not Vassa's writing, it says a black and an African who wrote his own life. He fell into fits if anyone pronounced his real name, and for this person, his real name was his birth name. He fell into fits if anyone pronounced his real name, which was Vallada Equiano. My father knew him, T. Phillips of Middlesex. Well, T. Phillips was the son of the publisher Phillips, who published Clarkson's PhD thesis and published Ramsey's works and published some of Granville Sharp's work, and was an abolitionist, a Quaker, very important. Did not publish Vassa's autobiography because Vassa published it himself, but they obviously knew each other. We know that anyway. The curious thing about it is it's signed T. Phillips, and my father knew him. It means that he wrote this after his father died, which was in 1799. How this letter from Vassa to Granville Sharp ended up in Phillips' hands is as curious as how it ended up in Chicago. And why Phillips spelled his last name with 2 P's rather than 1, which is what he does, I don't know. And who is T? Because the son who inherited the father's publishing business was William. So I can't answer those yet. That's one of the problems about doing this kind of work, is that when you answer one question, you usually find 4 or 5 more. And so the more questions are here, is I want to know who T. Phillips is, and I want to know more. But well, we're working on it. It's just one of those many, many details. But my point here really more is the fact that he's remembered in going into fits if someone referred to him by his birth name. That's so I've shown you this, I've shown you this, I've shown you this. And I want to give you a few facts based on, again, on some help of one of my other students, Lady Alpiza. We know of at least 28 editions of the interesting narrative. There are probably more. We keep finding them. We've done a survey of reviews of books that deal specifically with Vassa. Half of them are actually reviews of Vincent Corretta's biography. Most of the rest are of different editions of the interesting narrative that have been published. And there's a couple of others as well. All give credit all of these reviews give credit to a lot of Equiano and don't mention Gustavus Vassa. This is the shift that has somehow came about from the 1960s, from what had happened really over the previous century and a half or more about his name. We've identified 64 books that contain substantial information about Vassa. And there's only one, the book by Carly Saposnik, which is a collection of all of his letters and documents and so on that we use. Except for her book, all the references are to Willard Equiano. And I should happen to mention that Carly Saposnik is one of my students, which is the reason why she refers to Gustavus Vassa, because she understands and knows that. We've also looked at 143 articles published between 1967 and 2017. And the only article that refers to the author as Vassa is Alexander Bird's article. I've already mentioned mentioned Bird in terms of his contribution. All the others, again, have chosen, often I think without really thinking about it, to refer to this individual as Willard Equiano. Now we know why that came about in a sense, because the first serious scholar really to refer to Vassa by the name of Equiano was Paul Edwards in the late 1960s. As I mentioned yesterday, G.I. Jones in his chapter on Vassa that was published in Philip Curtin's Africa Remembered in 1967, which is when I first became aware of this man, referred to him as Walada because he was only interested in what was in the interesting narrative that related to the childhood of the man. And at that point, as a child, up through his enslavement, his name was Willard Equiano. So he called him that and never really explained anything. But all other scholars up until that point were referring to, such as Christopher Fife, who worked on Sierra Leone, referred to him, Thomas Hodgkin, who published the first little brief excerpt from the interesting narrative in his important book, Nigeria Perspectives, published in 1960. They all referred to him as Gustavus Vassa. And it was only in the late 1960s and continuing to the 1970s, in tandem with Black Power movement in the United States and the awakening and the civil rights movement, and in a sense, the recognition of Africanness as something that was important and viable, that modern scholarship fixed on the name Willard Equiano, the birth name, rather than the name that the person was actually known by and the name that he actually wanted to be known by. So what I want to do now is actually talk quite briefly about some of the individuals that we put, some of these 65 individuals, and this is where the Enlightenment comes in. Enlightenment was my way of sort of trying to suggest an age. Why is it? I understand full well that the concept of enlightenment in itself is very controversial. Was there such a thing? Or was there a disenlightenment that was really going on in many ways, and because of the issues of slavery and some other things? For me, it's more of a time and more to give an example or some indication of the types of individuals that Vassa was associated with and became concerned with and was interacted with in the course of his life. And many of those people that he was involved with were intellectuals, politically active, of course, the abolition movement, but not just the abolition movement, Thomas Hardy's London Corresponding Society wasn't specifically an abolition. It was really meant for parliamentary reform, and it was sympathetic to the French Revolution, and therefore got shut down in the 1790s. But these were his associations, were with these, what I would call leading intellectuals, political reformers. But even before that, his associations had been with the commercial world of the Caribbean initially, but then subsequently when he was free and was living back in London in the late 1760s, and where he took up as an occupation hairdressing. And you will note, of course, at the time that men wore these unbelievable wigs and stuff, so hairdressing was quite a business. And that was the occupation that he tried to make his living on as a free black in London. He wasn't really very successful at making a living out of it, which is why periodically he would enlist on a ship and go to the Mediterranean or go to the Caribbean or go to North America, because he, unlike most sailors at the time, or maybe in most times, when he went into port, he didn't drink all of his money away, and he didn't womanize, and he didn't spend money. He saved his money when he was on ship so that when he could get back to London as fast as possible, which is where he really wanted to be. So that so my sections on family, the family is actually, section of this is quite small because it includes references and discussions of his Igbo family, what we know about them. And then, of course, his wife, Susanna Cullen, and his two daughters, one of who died in infancy and one who lived until 1856, although she herself never had children. So there are no offspring or descendants of Vassa as far as we know, anyway. Susanna Cullen is particularly interesting. They apparently met in Cambridge. She was from Soham, just outside of Cambridge, and she was of Scottish descent. Her parents had come from Ely, which is not far from Cambridge also, but then ultimately from Scotland. And as I mentioned in one report from Edinburgh, when the couple were there on their honeymoon, the surprise, if not shock, that here was an African walking down the street with a white woman and his wife was white, as that was unusual, but that's the life they lived. And we don't really know too much about her except that she was a subscriber to two different editions of the interesting narrative. The next category of people are people that in one way or another were associated with Vassa and slavery, starting with Campbell, whose first name we don't know, who was a tobacco planter, I think, on the York River in Virginia. Continuing particularly to Michael Henry Pascal, who was his master during the 7 Years' War, and what we know about him and what we know about his cousins, the Gurin family, the two girls and the brother Maynard. Elizabeth and Maynard were the godparents at the baptism in 1759. Maynard died in 1760. But until then, Maynard was actually the accountant for his cousin, Pascal, which was a common practice where naval officers and sailors could receive their pay through a third party because they'd be at sea somewhere and they couldn't actually get it. Maynard acted as the accountant for Pascal, which is why it's really surprising that in that baptismal record, it's said that Vassa was born in South Carolina, because Maynard knew very well what Pascal's business was, because he was handling it. And he knew that he was a tobacco merchant, and he knew he was trading to Virginia. There isn't any question. So why that mistake, or why that was entered that way, is even more confusing and curious. But it certainly isn't Vassa's fault that that's the way it was entered. It was the godparents' fault. That's the point of having godparents, is they're supposed to vouch for the kid. And if it's an older kid, as this one was, they're supposed to say what they know. Why they said something else, who knows? In a section that relates to the religious connections that Vassa had, this is the Countess of Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, and the founder of the group of Methodists that were known as Huntingdonians, or were known as to be the Huntingdonian Connection, which was the Christianity that Vassa embraced. He was a follower of her, although it doesn't appear that he ever actually met her. Possible, but we don't know what. The Countess of Huntingdon broke with the Wesley brothers and the mainstream of the Methodist movement. And in the end, it actually died out as a sect within Christianity, pretty much. But for a period in England, it was associated with another number of extremely interesting individuals, all of whom, or some of them, I'm putting on this website, included the influence, of course, on Vassa was George Whitefield, who toured North America until his death in 1770, and was associated with what was known here as the Great Awakening, and preached to very large audiences, and he is the one who actually, in a sense, converted Vassa. And George Whitefield, I should have a picture of him, yeah. You can see what a hairdresser has to do. George Whitefield also was converted. John Morant, probably, maybe at exactly the same time that Vassa heard Whitefield in Charleston is when Morant heard Whitefield in Charleston. Now, whether at the exact same sermon or not, we can't know, but it was they were both heard Whitefield in Charleston in the late 1760s. Morant went on to Nova Scotia as a black loyalist, and was Huntingdonian, a very important one in terms of preacher, and there's almost certain that at some point in London the two would have met. I can't prove it, but again, in reference to what I said about what I've learned from Natalie Zeman Davis, this is where my historical imagination comes in, because there weren't that many churches, and these Huntingdonians seem to have sought each other out all over the place. The other real connection with the Huntingdonians that's so important for us is that the black loyalists in Nova Scotia, who the brother of Thomas Clarkson, John Clarkson, recruited for Sierra Leone, almost all of the blacks from Nova Scotia that went to Sierra Leone were Huntingdonians. And so therefore, extremely likely that the continued connection between Vassa, who had a great interest in Sierra Leone, as you know, but he didn't go on that first expedition. It didn't mean that he wasn't interested in what was going on there. It was not just the Huntingdonian connection. But in Vassa's will, he left money for a school in Sierra Leone. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because we've been trying to track down that school and who he actually left money to and how it happened. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. But that Huntingdonian connection connected him with several other extremely interesting individuals, all radicals, or what we would call radicals, or really political activists in a major way, one of whom was Robert Wedderburn, who was preaching as a Huntingdonian in Soho, in London, very close to where Vassa was living. Again, it's impossible that they never met. Wedderburn went on and continued to preach when he wasn't thrown in jail. He continued to preach right into the 1820s. And Robert Wedderburn is an extremely interesting character in his own life. His father, Wedderburn, was an extremely wealthy Scottish planter who owned something like 14 plantations in Jamaica. I've been to the sites of all of them. All of them are in Westmoreland or in Hastings in Jamaica. Wedderburn had a mistress. That was Robert's mother. And Robert's mother got a promise out of Daddy Wedderburn that the next baby that was born was going to be born free. And he abided by that. He beat the shit out of her several times, we know. He sold her to somebody else. He didn't want to have anything to do with her anymore. But the kid was born free. So Robert Wedderburn got on a ship when he got old enough, tried to get into the castle in Scotland and couldn't even get in the servants' entrance. Completely disowned. And that's when he turned his attention to preaching in London, in Soho, putting up broadsides. Titles of his sermons were such things as, "Do slaves have a right to kill their masters?" That sort of got people a little bit upset. And then another one was, there's nothing wrong with religion except the clergy. These were things that got him thrown into jail a little later on, as you can well imagine. Those sermons have been published, so it's you can see the connections. Well, I'm not sure. I have to go back on that, but for me, I'm a Canadian. Wedderburn is really crucial because you know who Robert Wedderburn's half-sister was Lady Selkirk. And her husband and herself, they're the one who bought the Hudson Bay Company. Because the Wedderburn family said, we better get out of slavery and invest in Canada. Because slavery is going to go, and we don't want these 14 plantations anymore. We want to divest from that and get involved in something else. And of course, if you're Canadian, you know that Selkirk is one of the Canadian national heroes and founders of our country. And of course, one of the side things about all of this research is to really demonstrate that there was no part of the Americas that was peripheral to slavery. No part. And this is just one example from a Canadian side where, we weren't just a haven for people on the Underground Railroad. No. The story is far more complex, and you see it in the case of Robert Wedderburn's half-sister. Of course, they never communicated. His half-brother was the one who owned the West India docks in London, which is where the museum is today. So you see those connections. Okay. Thank you.
Give it time for questions.
Okay. So these are the examples that I'm giving, that I can give. I was going to go into more that, This is Whitfield Chapel in London. Well, it's no longer there. It was torn down in 1890 and replaced by another church. And this is where Vassa was buried. We haven't known where Gustavus Vassa was buried. This has been a big mystery for a long, long time, and it really was only discovered last fall. And for those of you who know London, this is Tottenham Court Road. The church that's standing there now is called the American Church. It's right next to the Goodge Street Underground station. And that little park that's next to it is where he's buried. I'm just going to go through. Blumenbach, this is important mainly because this was a German anthropologist who's considered to be the father of racist German anthropology. And he went to London specifically to meet Vassa in the 1790s. And when Blumenbach wrote his racialized theories about human beings and put people into a hierarchy, he even said even the lowest people on this hierarchy, the black people, have people who are really smart, like this guy, Gustavus Vassa. And Blumenbach did a review in German of the interesting narrative, and he oversaw the publication of the interesting narrative in German. I talked about him. There's Lady Selkirk. And here's another individual who he had to have met in London. This is Chevalier de Saint-Georges, often called the Black Mozart, because he composed so much amazing classical music similar to Mozart, which you can all go online and listen to if you haven't. He was in London twice in the 1790s, and it's virtually absolutely certain, because he was an abolitionist too, and because of where he was, that they would have met. I was going to go on finally, but I won't, and talk about the industrialists and the scientists that he interacted with and where he went, particularly in the Western Midlands, in Shropshire area, in the Black Country, which was very thick with the industrialization, and in which people that he was associated with, most especially Alexander Blair, who was Dr. Irving's partner, owned factories and mines. And so that all of these connections are what I try to do, what we're doing with the website. And of course, eventually, I will complete this in a more traditional form as well. But that website, as far as I'm concerned, has been really instrumental in putting materials together in a new way that allow us to see things in a relational pattern. So the Enlightenment itself, in some ways, peripheral, but that's the context, the period that we call Enlightenment. Vassa writes about economic development in Africa in a way that shows very clearly that he had read Adam Smith very carefully. Some of it what he says sounds as if it came right out of Adam Smith, not as if he was plagiarizing it, but because he had really absorbed those ideas about how economic development could take place in Africa once the slave trade was stopped. And he gives an analysis of how that would come about. It's very interesting. And I didn't talk about Joseph Banks, who was the founder of the Royal Society, but he knew Banks very well through Irving. He knew James Watt, who invented the steam engine, very well, because Watt stayed with Dr. Irving in Pall Mall in London on many times when he came from Scotland to London, and at times when we know that Vassa was there. So that when we put all of these people together into a network that either directly or indirectly relates to Vassa, I suggest that we see one of the most important things that I've been trying to do with biography was to show that we're not talking about slavery, we're talking about a human being and his whole life, or her whole life. And this is really my fundamental aim in looking at Vassa in this much detail. Thank you.
Paul, that's fascinating, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who wanted to get at you, you know, in the best sense of that, to ask you questions. And I have a lot, but I'll just start with one or two. What's interesting about Selena Hastings, the Countess of Huntington, is that basically she subsidized the first black writers in English, as you know. Grania Saul, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley dedicates her book to her. John Morant. And we know that if Equiano Vassa, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, if they didn't meet, he certainly read them, because Vassa takes the trope of the talking book from John Morant, and John Morant took it from Grania Saul. You know, all of them. And Paul Edwards is the first person ever to footnote that. And then I did the chapter, The Trope of the Talking Book. So all these people had to know each other. Look, if you're black in London now, in an intellectual circle, you know each other, let alone 200 years ago. I wanted to ask you about the Muslim slave narratives. When you back to your first website, how do you say? I never knew how to say Bakwakwa. How does one say it? It's a word that I've never heard said before. His surname.
It's wonderful. Skip, thank you for that. That's the most wonderful question. And the reason is that Robin Law and I originally published Bakwakwa's autobiography.
Uh-huh.
And as you know, we really did it as a long introduction to the text with footnotes and so on. Mm-hmm. We're now, with Bruno Varas and Nilson Bazara in Brazil, we're now finishing a real biography of this guy, not just reprinting his thing, because we know so much more about him. Again, it's the problem with biography, is that you, as I've said before.
That's what second and third editions are for, brother, you know?
No, this has gone so far beyond that. For example, it says Bakwakwa's autobiography the editor was someone by the name of Samuel Moore. Well, Robin Law and I got who that Samuel Moore is completely wrong.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, that's only one minor detail. The other thing is Bakwakwa. We didn't know what the name meant. His full name was Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa.
Yeah, he was a Muslim.
He was a Muslim. He was named Muhammad even though he wasn't a firstborn male in his family, which means that he really was named after his mother's father, who was named Muhammad. That's a pattern in Hausa society. This is how things are usually done and would have been done then. So Muhammad is easy. Gardo is not. He doesn't explain it. He says, "I was born after twins." Well, in Hausa, Gardo is a nickname for a child who's born after twins. He doesn't say that, but we know it.
Right.
Bakwakwa was the real mystery. And it was only a year ago that Bruno Varas and I were in Katsina, which is where his mother was from. And we were talking with people and everything. We have so much, we puzzle. What is Bakwakwa? What is this name?
Well,
and they kept saying, "You're pronouncing it wrong."
Sure. But that's the nature of scholarship, that we're all dependent on each other. We revise ourselves, that we grow. And the great thing about the internet and these websites is that we could share our knowledge. I remember when Alan Austin, Blaskingham and I, remember we edited that series. I was a kid, and we published his Muslim slave narrative book.
Yes.
You remember? I mean, that's 30 years ago.
Yeah.
1982, I think.
And Austin is the one who, as far as I know, is the first person who discovered Bakwakwa.
Yes, but now we know, because of the transatlantic slave trade database, you can begin, and we know about the history of Africa, the Muslim conversion, how early West Africa converted to Islam. That, when I was growing up in college, nobody ever talked about the Islamic, the huge percentage of the slaves who would have come from Islamic cultures. But now we know that 25% of the 388,000 Africans who came to the United States
We're Muslims.
were Muslim, right? They came from Senegal and Gambia. They had to be. Everybody was a Muslim. They were Muslim and traditional, but there are ways that we now can layer and provide more context. The final thing, and then I'll drop the mic because we'll be having dinner, I guess, is the reason that it's important in Nigeria, and it was important for black people, my generation, and my teachers, to call him Equiano, that was his African name. And you can't underestimate the importance of that political gesture. For you, you're reclaiming the name that he used himself, which is fine. You have overwhelming evidence that he preferred to call himself Gustavus Vassa. But that ain't going to happen in Igbo land. That's going to be a footnote. He's going to be called Equiano.
He is.
Yes, but I just encourage you to remember that there's another side of the coin. There's a reason why it's important to keep that name too.
Which is
not only the name that some white man gave him, you know what I mean? Even if in his own desire to be a citizen and cosmopolitan, everyone has the right to pick their own name, right? But that's why Equiano remains important, because it's his African name. And even if it was one word and they made it to blah, 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 you see what I'm saying? I hope you wouldn't throw it into the dustbin of history. It's got its own logic for being reclaimed and being used.
Which
and that's
is-
a black nationalist.
which is why the website's called Equiano's World.
Right. Yeah, because nobody would find it under.
Well, there's that aspect too.
Yeah, right.
But let me just go back to Bakwakwa again because of the pronunciation, because we were completely wrong, because it's actually two words. It's Ba in Hausa, it's Ba in Kwakwa.
And
then-
Equiano's got one word, you said.
Yes,
Yeah.
the two names are really one word.
Right. John.
Thank you. That's incredibly rich. You've already answered my one question about why you name it Equiano's World. That's just been answered, so thank you. That's terrific. The other also relates to Skip's point about just the people that he knew, and I'm thinking of two other figures. Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote, who was in London, who wrote this beautiful, glowing poem on Whitfield. In Vassa's material, have you come across anything about anything that he mentions or met with Wheatley? I can't imagine him not meeting her, seeing her when she was there. And the other is Somerset and Lord Mansfield.
Yeah, she's there in the summer of '73.
Right, right. Almost certainly would have met her if he wasn't in the Mediterranean. And as for Somerset, yes, well, he was extremely aware of the Somerset case, and that goes. In his case, he tried to save his friend John Annis,
Right.
and he went to Grenville Sharp, and he knew about it, and he actually got a writ of habeas corpus, but was not able to deliver it. Because Fitzpatrick, the guy's former master who had captured him again, realized what was going on and hid. And then got the guy Annis onto the ship and got him out of the country where you couldn't submit, you couldn't deliver a writ of habeas corpus. So he did know all about that, and he discusses that.
Yeah.
He never mentions, and in nothing does he ever mention anything in relation to Phyllis Wheatley.
But the idea, Phyllis Wheatley's the most famous black person in the Western world when she shows up in London.
I know.
And she became famous because she wrote the broads of the elegy for Whitfield
Yes.
in
Mhm.
1770.
Yes.
And that was like a runaway bestseller.
It's huge bestseller.
Yeah, it was a huge
Yes.
bestseller.
So he has to know her.
Yeah, he had to know. The one thing I would encourage you to do is, I don't know how to say this in a way. When you talk, it's like you have Vince Coretta on your head when you're trying to disprove Coretta's claims. I would encourage you to flip the script. You don't need to do that. You could lead with the positive and not feel like you're on the defensive. You have a gold mine of information there's 10,000 reasons to think that he was born in Igbo land, just like he said. And if I were you, I would bury Vin. You know, I like Vin, he's my friend, but I'd bury him in a footnote, man, and just accentuate the positive, as the Disney thing say. You see what you know what I mean, John? Because you got him in your head, and you don't need to do that.
That's right.
You like 12 of them are Corettas. I would even take that off. Let people find that. Vin had found one little thing and decided that this was an important way to make a claim about, you know, whatever his motivation was. But you have such a strong case for his Africanity. So I would encourage you to lead with that, you know, to lead with what you know, instead of playing defense to a claim made by, you know, a scholar I admire, a literary scholar, who, you know, backed his way into black literature in the 18th century quite. I mean, you know, he's done magnificent editions.
Mm-hmm, he has.
I love all the editions of the slave narratives he's done in the 18th century. But can you help me out here, Stauffer?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
the world that you developed in your talk and your websites is amazingly rich. I completely agree with Skip. You don't, not only do you not need him, it detracts from
Yes.
the extraordinary material that you have.
Yes.
So that's why it means going on the offensive. By including Coretta, that it will it detracts from the amazing resources, the amazing scholarship you've already done. And
Thanks.
it speaks for itself.
Mhm.
You don't need it.
Yeah, you know, lead with what you know, basically you say, he was not, you know, your first sentence is, Gustavus Vassa was not born in South Carolina. That's the wrong way around. Olada Equiano was born in Igbo land. You see what I mean? And I know, and by the way, where's the section on circumcision? I'm telling you, that circumcision point is your strongest evidence in a way. I mean, it is such a subtle point, and when I'm repeating what I said yesterday. You told me that on the phone a few years ago when I called you to ask you what you thought about it, and it knocked my head off. And it's such a subtle point, you have to mention that. But John and I mean, at least we agreed that you have to, you know, be assertive and just take the claim on the guy, and worry about, put the refutations in the footnotes, not the other way around, because it's extraordinary what you've done.
Yeah, really.
And yeah, a lot of people plagiarized, and I wouldn't be defensive about that. First of all, our concept of what plagiarism is has changed a lot since the 18th century, and people summarize closely. You know, that's just the way discourse worked. So it didn't make him a bad person or stupid, but you know, he didn't go to Oxford, Cambridge. Nobody told him about footnotes and quotations, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be surprised if there weren't whole passages he taken from someplace else, but who cares? That's the way it was for a lot of writers in the 18th century. But he obviously was a very brilliant man.
Well, he certainly was.
Yeah.
And what I like to know is where he got the idea about footnotes.
Well, from another book. You know.
Yeah, there were footnotes and.
Yeah, no, I know, but where he, for some reason, he adopted that and decided this was what he was going to do in writing his autobiography. And I haven't elaborated on it, but another thing that has preoccupied me a lot is when did he write what he wrote? Because as you know, the interesting narrative itself is not a consistent piece of literature. It's got different styles and different, it's very clear there's a portion of it that's written from diaries that he had kept, because he has such details that are not the types of things you're going to remember. And it's very clear that obviously about his childhood, he's drawing on not only his memory, but what his reflections are about it and what he's learned. So that's a different. And then he doesn't write anything or say anything at all about the North American war of the American Revolution. Doesn't say anything about it anywhere, although he was he spent a couple of years of that time at southeast of London, where the British Army was prepared in case the French tried to invade, and so he obviously was around and he knew, but he never says anything.
When did he come back to London? When did he settle in London?
Oh, he was consistently in London from about 1766 on, except when he was traveling. So that was obviously his choice of where he wanted to live. So.
Jeffrey Sanborn's work on William Wells Brown, maybe we could talk about a few things, but William Wells Brown borrows from other people a lot. Sanborn points out that William Wells Brown, he comes later, in his 1840s, but William Wells Brown footnotes, and Sanborn describes very, I think, wonderfully and brilliantly how and why, the uses to which William Wells Brown is lifting passages from Lydia Maria Child and other scholars, and how we understand, and how at the time people understood that,
Right.
which resonates for me with Vassa.
Mhm.
Yeah, I wouldn't be defend, I would just footnote it
Yeah.
and say, here, look, I wrote a memoir. It did very well. And I did a lot of research on what I could possibly have seen on TV, for example, when I was 8 years old. Well, hell, I don't remember what the nightly lineup was in our 3 channels, right? But when I went to the place where I wrote it, I took the Billboard Top 100 for that year and all kind. I mean, any autobiographer does stuff like that, you know?
Mhm.
And he probably, how old was he when he leaves Africa?
When he
Leaves Africa?
Uh,
When he's enslaved?
he says 11, 12.
Right. So how much can you remember from the time you were 11 and 12? You can
Right.
remember a lot one way, but
Mhm.
another way.
You don't remember a lot.
And so he
Mhm.
would have to go back and read books about Africa, and just
Mhm.
in order to make a book
I
about it.
mean, any autobiographer would do that.
He
Yeah.
does, yes.
Sure. A
Yeah.
good autobiography.
Yeah, good.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's going to be a short book.
That's right, that's right.
Can I ask something? What is the reception of the book in Africa by itself? Because you are a, Canadian, Coretta, it's an American, but I'm wondering if there is, research in Nigeria, how the book was reviewed, or they used to teach in Africa?
His autobiography.
I know, but in the same way that you were talking here, there is a reception history. So my question is, what they write about the book, about Vassa in Nigeria?
They love him.
Mm-hmm.
And they would never call him Vassa.
Well,
He's the father of African literature in Nigeria. That's why it was so scandalous when Vince did it. I mean, he went there, they wanted to lynch him. You know? It's not a joke. This is a very serious thing. And
Mhm.
that's why all the people gave you a standing ovation, right? You're the savior. You saved the African for African literature. But what's the answer to Mary Ellen's question? Was it reviewed? Do we know in the history of its
translated
reception?
into
The main,
Igbo.
the main thrust of scholarship in Nigeria about him is about where he's born.
But before that, before the controversy,
There wasn't any knowledge.
no, people right in the history.
So 1960 was when it would be first known about in Nigeria, because it was Thomas Hodgkin's Nigerian Perspective, which was used in the 3 universities that existed at the time. And that's where the knowledge of him began, in Nigeria.
But in no other book about black literature, or the slave narratives before, did Marion Wilson Starling mention him, do we know? In John?
I don't know.
Or even Toni Morrison, and her, that encyclopedia she did, where she mentions
The
Nate
Black Book?
McCune, Nate McCune Smith. And
Right.
Yeah, I just have to go back to see it.
Or Vernon Loggins.
Or Vernon Loggins.
Vernon
yeah.
Loggins wrote the best book about Negro literature in 1931.
I don't know him. I got to look at that.
Yeah, look at that and see. I don't know.
It's very possible. Du Bois certainly knew about him.
Did he write about it?
He mentions him.
Well, but that's why, if you say not known in Nigeria, Nigerian intellectuals are reading Du Bois,
Yeah,
so.
they may have.
Yeah.
It must also be surely in the bibliography of Schomburg's bibliography of the Negro. It has to be listed.
Oh, no, let's check when we get home. I got it upstairs, because I'm teaching it, and see, yeah.
I would think that it would be in Schomburg's collection.
Actually, Du Bois publishes a number of bibliographies, and he is mentioned in some of his, in the
Yeah.
bibliographies.
Yeah.
The extensive bibliographies that are books that then scholars
Mhm.
eventually turn to, he's mentioned.
I don't know about those bibliographies, but I do know that Du Bois does mention him.
That would be good. I mean, I'm less interested in those references than in the 12 reviews of Vin Coretta's book. You know, like the history of what Marielle's suggesting, the critical reception to him around the world. He was famous.
Especially in, Calabar.
Ernie?
Schomburg does mention the Negroes, and he's actually mentioned the text of the Negro Days of the Past. So,
Good.
so any.
Thank you.
That's of 1925.
25,
Great.
and that book circulates
Oh, yeah, it was a bestseller.
in the U.S., but also
Right.
in the Caribbean and Latin America.
And then there was, check Daniel P. Murray's bibliography of Negro writing from 1900. He was the black assistant librarian at the Library of Congress. And he was one of the first new Negro intellectuals of the first era. And I think Du Bois talked to him. They were all part of the same planning group for the Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition in 1900. And one of the things they were doing was marshaling evidence of intellect among people of African descent. So they were preparing these lists of who had published what. And William Wells Brown wrote a history of black people.
Yeah,
What's it
yeah,
called?
After
Well, I'm certainly going to get back to you on all of this because I haven't pursued
We should have.
the early 20th century.
the other person would be Alexander Crummell, who goes to Africa, he lives, he writes extensive, he writes scholarly work, he footnotes a lot of things, he moves to Africa. He's best known as being the subject of Du Bois's chapter in Souls of Black Folk.
And now you can do literature searches. I mean,
Yes,
you can,
yes.
this is not going to take you a year to find out. Ernie Mitchell there can find it out in like 15 seconds. Yeah. But Greg Wad doesn't write about it in 1808, when, the literature of Negroes. Equiano didn't make the cut. Anyway, this is all like in shop. Any last, we need to.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
We need to have food and drink out there. Final question.
I'm just going to go from a different angle altogether. Talking about the sexual, social scenery in London in terms of interracial relationships, because you were talking about Vassa going back to London with money, not wanting to spend it on booze, on women, or anything like that. And I wondered if there was a scenery there that he could blow the money on booze and money with people. Whether they were black people or people that were from different places in the world. The social scenery, that's basically the question I'm asking about.
Well, I don't see anything, and now you're going beyond where my area of specialization is, but I don't see anything in those Mediterranean trips that he was involved that would have prevented him from being involved in doing things on shore that other seamen did.
But was that permissible out there in London to come back
think
and
so.
really get into like the bars and the clubs and do your thing?
Depends where, but I don't think there was anything that was limiting that in many of the Mediterranean ports he was in at least.
Okay, thank you so much.